The question to start with from that gentleman there with the sweater with the zip on. Could you just stand up and give your short question to the panel?
Yeah, so my question principally is for Bill Cash, and it's in regard to the issue of free trade treaties with America. I get the point about 20% reduction in tariffs, but when I look at the press, they're talking about tiny reductions in tariff and tiny increases in trade with America. It sounds superficial. Am I wrong?
Just one other thing, the panel, if they can keep their comments as brief as possible, we'll get more comments in and we can move forward. Bill?
I simply think that our trading internationally is the key to, as the panel have indicated, is the key to our future prosperity. We run the most monumental deficit with the EU, and in particular as it happens with Germany. I'm sure my figures are not completely up to date, but Patrick said 100 billion deficit is about right. And our surplus with the rest of the world is significant. Now, all I'm saying in respect of the United States is that it's a monumentally big market. We have, and it's partly political this, it is not just economics, and I know that I'm the politician and certainly not the economist on this panel, but you see, it seems to me that if you have good working relations with the United States, and you can trade with them, okay, they will look after their own national interests. But a lot of the stuff about chlorinated chicken and things like that is a complete fiction. And frankly, they do in fact. There's a huge scare story being built up with the agricultural industry. Again, it's the Remainers at work, trying to undermine our relationship with the United States. So I say this, that the benefits of our leaving the European Union, which we've now done, will be translated into demonstrating the sort of things, in my opinion, which were demonstrable in the 19th century when Congdon and Bright decided and got the repeal of the Corn Laws, followed by the Representation of the People Act. And what's that got to do with it? Well, first of all, America was seen by both of them as the big marketplace, is complemented by the freedom of choice in the political marketplace. And that's where our relationship with the rest of the world, whether it's Australia, whether it is Canada, whether it is New Zealand, whether it is Singapore, wherever it is, everything that I've heard today from the economists rings true to me. We then have huge opportunities. And I don't really think, if I may say so, that I am much bothered by some of the arguments which permeated the premise of your question. Because if you have the opportunity to trade across the world, and you can do so on the sort of basis that our economists are saying, and I wish there were more of them in Downing Street, I'll be honest with you about this. At the moment, a lot of the arguments are run on the Brexit front without a sufficient degree of economic foundation. Margaret understood this. That's why she took on people such as Tim and Patrick, and of course Roger as well. So if I'm not answering your question in quite the terms in which you put it, it's because I'm more interested in the international ability to be able to trade freely with other countries, because I believe ultimately that is where your real success lies. And I'm certain that by leaving the European Union, which has shackled us, the clinical trials, business regulation, I wrote about this years ago, about the impact of Working Time Directive and God knows what else. All these factors are incredibly important in ensuring, if we get rid of them, that we'll be able to trade more effectively throughout the world.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel like to comment on this, or shall I move on to the next question?
I'd like to just...
Tim?
I'm a unilateral free trader. Hong Kong and Singapore have no trade barriers at all. They don't have special free trade agreements. I mean, they do, in fact, they have signed one or two, but that's simply because of, they're basically, there are no tariff barriers, there are no import restrictions. I'd like Britain to be like that, so that our manufacturers can buy the lowest cost inputs in the world freely, and our consumers can buy the lowest cost products from anywhere in the world freely. And therefore, that's where I'd like to go. I'm not, this all the stuff about these different free trade agreements. No, the best policy is absolute free trade.
Thank you. Just put your question. The panel are very close to you. They'll be able to hear you.
So, question for Patrick Minford. You have famously said that our farming doesn't necessarily need to survive. Do you think it would survive?
Yes, I do, because it's a matter of productivity. You know, I mean, the point, I've been quite frequently misquoted on what I was saying, which was that there would be more competition, and the parts of manufacturing that would do well would be the ones that are more skill intensive, like services. In fact, a lot of manufacturing is really misclassified. Oh, right. A lot of manufacturing is misclassified services. You think about what Dyson does. He actually, he's a manufacturing industry, but a lot of what he does is actually design here and research and so forth, which is classified in manufacturing. So there'll be a rise in productivity, and that what would actually contract would be what one would call kind of basic metal bashing manufacturing. And I think that as far as farming is concerned, it's a highly productive industry, and its productivity has risen enormously over the last few decades, and I think it'll continue to do so. I don't see any problems with it at all.
Okay, next question. Yes, gentleman there.
Mr. Cash, is the current scale of no-deal preparations, the scale adequately reflect the likelihood of this outcome?
Yes, I mean, all the information that I have from within government, and I'm pretty close to what's going on, is that there is a very clear understanding that we could end up by having to walk away. And the language, the aggression with which Barnier, for example, is presenting the arguments, and the, I'm glad to say, very robust response, as evidenced by David Frost's speech a couple of weeks ago, it just points out that we are not going to be taken for a ride by their terms and conditions. We have our sovereignty. We are going to make our own minds up in accordance with the decisions taken both in the general election and the referendum, and it's crystal clear. But the consequence of that is that you do have to prepare properly, and we are not going to be foisted with their regulatory arrangements. The European Court of Justice, Northern Ireland Protocol, I can get more complicated about this, but in a nutshell, you're right to ask the question. And it seems to me that Boris Johnson and the government completely understand this, and the degree of preparation that's being put into it, and the number of people that are being put on the task is commensurate with the probability that we will end up by having to walk away, unless they give in. And don't forget, we did beat the Napoleonic blockade.
Thank you very much. Sir, your question.
How long can EU survive without Britain? I keep reading the team.
That's for you, Roger.
Thank you. A short question. Gentlemen.
I think I've been deputed by Patrick to answer that. Of course, I'm not going to answer you directly in terms of the number of years. That really is a forecasting task well beyond me. But I think the substance of your question is right, that our departure is going to, I think, knock a serious hole in the EU. For a start, of course, there are the budgetary contributions, and no country is lining up saying, please, can we pay more? That's going to be a major problem. And there's also the balance of views within the EU, with the Germans desperately worried about being left alone in bed with the French, and the French being worried about being left in bed alone with the Germans, and everyone else worried about the pair of them. This is going to be a major problem. But I think so much is going to depend upon how we do. If we do well outside the EU, which is not, in my view, guaranteed, but I'm optimistic that we shall do well, then I think it's going to light a beacon across Europe, and there are going to be a number of countries that are going to want to lead. Now, Tim made these very interesting remarks about demographics. I think that is going to be a major problem within the Union, but it's not the only one. There's a serious loss of faith across Europe now in the ideals, if I can call them that, of the European Union. And if we do well, then I think we'll see a series of countries. Now, which might be first? Well, Italy, of course, has got major problems of its own. It's got a serious monetary and financial problem. I don't think it should have joined the euro. I think it should leave the euro. That's a big issue, and it's got severe demographic problems and other problems. The two countries that I think are most likely to follow a British lead are the Netherlands and Sweden. Sweden, in particular, interesting country, of course, hasn't adopted the euro, got the same sort of democratic tradition that we have very strongly. I think if we do well, we'll see other countries wanting to peel off. And it doesn't take, I think, more than one or at most two of these for the whole thing to come under question. Now, when I say the EU coming to an end, let me be clear about this. It's a bit like the Roman Empire. You know, when did the Roman Empire fall? It wasn't sort of on the 22nd of July, 410 or something or other. It was a gradual process. And I think this may happen with the EU, and the EU may transmogrify into something else, which could be a good thing. Now, personally, I would like some sort of European association that gave us security cooperation, friendship, maybe environmental cooperation. I just don't want to be part of a common European state, thank you very much. I think it's possible that our departure may set in train a series of changes which land up with that result. So that there's some sort of association, I don't know what it's going to call, but it's not trying to drive us towards ever closer union.
Tim, just very quickly, it's very important for Britain to have stable, prosperous neighbours and for us to be friendly with them. Yes. So let's just say that first, okay. But I agreed entirely with what Roger's just been saying, but I'd point out another interesting country is Ireland.
Yeah.
You see, Ireland is almost unique in Europe at the moment. It doesn't have any demographic problems. It has them kind of out 80 years away, but not at the moment. Partly because there's immigration into Ireland. Ireland's now a rich country. And Ireland's being asked to become a net contributor now that we've got a net contributor to the budget. No, they're saying no. And why? And what is the big argument? Implicitly, you could see what's going on. We can leave. And the Irish have really been bullied about their cut with their corporate taxes. They have lower corporate taxes than us. Watch this space. Now, of course, the Republic and the history, of course, their relations with us are so difficult historically. Most of their trade is with the English-speaking world. Sure. They're actually an English-speaking nation. They say that. We're an English-speaking nation to attract the foreign investors. I'd watch the Irish relations with the rest of the EU.
Yeah. Yes, gentleman here, could you?
Thank you. I'd just like to ask the economist, as a son of a Midlands manufacturer, I'm fed to the back teeth of the north-south divide and the overwhelming concentration of economic power and intellectual property concentrated here in London. The air of the past hangs very heavily over our regional economies. I just wonder whether you had a prescription for the fundamental regeneration of our regions, which I think lies at the heart of all of this.
Well, I'll have a go at this one, if you like. I think that, actually, it's wrong to think of the regions as kind of something apart in the UK. There's something called the UK. And the success of the UK, and Roger talked about the Thatcher supply-side policies, which had a big effect throughout the UK. And people often forget that a lot of northern cities are doing extremely well and have thriving financial sectors. Think of Leeds. And will also and are very important in manufacturing, and I gave an answer earlier about what will happen in manufacturing. It'll be a huge surge in productivity, and it'll be a world-beating industry. I think it'll be world-beating because it'll raise productivity and react, and that will be largely in the north or the outside London. So I think there's no real difference, it seems to be, in the prescription for the UK and the prescription for the North. I mean, the North is the overwhelming part of the UK. I use North figuratively for everything in favour of cutting taxes and increasing competitiveness. That will meet congestion in the South. And so it'll spill over naturally into the economy as a whole, because it can't all be concentrated in London. I mean, if we get a successful economy, there's no room anymore to be extra successful in the southeast. It's kind of coming apart at the seams. So in that sense, I think it's kind of a false dichotomy of general policy to kind of say, I want to focus on the North. We want to focus on the UK, and it will automatically benefit the North, and that will be where all the kind of most response will be, because of the lack of land and people in the South to kind of respond to it so vigorously as can be done in the North.
Roger.
Yeah, this is of course an incredibly difficult issue, and governments have been grappling with this for a long time, including in other countries besides us. I've got a few ideas. There is no magic bullet, I think. I've got a few ideas. First of all, let me say what I think is not the answer. HS2. I think this is... very, very old-fashioned thinking, it seems to me, that you revive the North by increasing connectivity with the South. This is very strange. I mean, if anything, it seems to me it may drain activity from these regions rather than boost it. And connectivity is pretty good anyway, actually. And other people have said this before. What I think really could make a difference is improving east-west connectivity in the North and spending less money on that than's being spent on HS2, and I think to much greater effect. One of the, I think, serious problems that happens when a region starts to suffer, and it's very difficult to turn this round, is the depletion in the stock of human capital. And that is what has, I think, happened in many of our regions. You see it in other countries too. First of all, you go through a period of decline and deindustrialization, and you get large numbers, and it was principally men, middle-aged men without work, and you get all the problems associated with all that. And that means that the towns and the cities take on the air of a depressed environment. So you get the young people leaving, and that's a very difficult dynamic to turn round. Now, the trick, it seems to me, is we don't want to squash London. Every so often, some bright spark comes up with an idea that the way to cope with all this, dare I say it in the past, I think they've usually come from the Lib Dem party, the way to cope with all this is basically to squash London, and somehow or other magically, all the benefits and strengths supposedly goes up north. That seems to me to be completely the wrong idea. I mean, London's a global city, the global city, and it's a great prize and jewel for us. We must maintain it. Yeah. But I think we've got to invest in all those things that affect the character of those other regions. Patrick's right. Some great cities have done extremely. Leeds has done, I think, extremely well at revival. But we've got to, Manchester. We've got to work on things like certainly the infrastructure and the connectivity, the airports and the railways, the universities, the cultural facilities, all those things. But I'm afraid it's going to be a long time, I think, before we turn this round.
Tim, just a very, very quick point. There's this common tendency in this discussion to blame the decline of the North on the Conservative government of 79 to 97 and then to personalise it in Maggie Thatcher. The truth is that manufacturing production rose in Britain from 1979 to 97. Not only that, but there was a huge increase in the productivity in British manufacturing, so that whereas in the 1970s most of manufacturing industries in the UK were beneath the international average, by the late 1990s we're up in line with the international average. Under the new Labour government of 97 to 2010, manufacturing production fell. Let's just be clear about when these things happened. The supply side policies under the Thatcher government, the Major government of 79 to 97, did not lead to a reduction in British manufacturing output.
I'll now just take one last question because we're running up right against 1 o'clock. Could you please make the question very short, sir?
I'll try to. It's a question for Patrick Minford relating to your speech when you were talking about the 5 billion, I understand, which will be paid by our European counterparts if we're making exports to them, and 13 billion, which will be the tariffs payable by the exporters to the United Kingdom. and that will be paid by those exporters because we are operating under what kind of a scenario would this be? Do we have a free trade agreement? Is it predicated on that free trade agreement with the United States or World Trade Organization tariffs, in which case surely then we have to charge the same trade tariffs to all of the countries on the same basis, so there would be no advantage. So it's just really, I mean, maybe we should go for Tim's option of just having completely free trade with no tariffs for everybody. But it's a question, what's your argument is predicated on, please?
Well, I was trying to explain that the US is such a big supplier. At best value, the evidence is the US can supply us with more or less everything we import at world prices in sufficient quantities to supply our current import needs. So they would dominate these markets in food and manufacturing. And therefore, effectively, the US trade agreement's really effectively the same as what unilateral free trade would do, because it's such an important supplier of all these major things that we import that are protected by the EU. That's the premise of my argument. So therefore, the EU would then compete with this at world prices, and that's why it wouldn't be able to pass on the tariffs. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick, and thank you to all of our panel this morning.